Amy is the author. She clicked record, it's happening. So Amy is the author of Tender Points, a book-length lyric essay exploring sexual violence, chronic pain, and patriarchy through lived experience and pop culture. Tender Points was originally published by Timeless Infinite Light in 2015 and re-released by Nightboat Books in 2019. Amy's writing and conversations have appeared in publications including Bitch, The Believer, Bomb, and Jewish Currents. She's the host of the Amy's Kitchen Organics reading series and the founder of Mondo Bummer, an experimental small press. Amy lives in San Francisco, where it's cloudy, and she's currently working on a novel called Utopia and Other Problems, and another novel that she calls Untitled Bisexual Jumpsuit Projects. So with that, I will hand over to you, Amy, for your reading from Tender Points.
Sure, and I feel like I ought to do a self-description. I recently was in conversation with Shannon Finnegan and Bojana Kokliat, who are the creators of the Alt Text is Poetry project, and they together made this amazing workshop about thinking about alt text as a kind of poetry. It was so fun talking to them, and it got me thinking for the first time about different approaches to self-description. And I realized that mine, if I were to be completely honest, would be a white woman with a trendy shag haircut. So here I am. I'm a white woman with a trendy shag haircut and glasses, wearing a yellow shirt. And I'm going to read from Tender Points, just a few pages to set the scene. Every morning I wake up feeling like I was run over by a truck. I feel like I've been hit by a bus. I wake up feeling like I got whiplash. I wake up feeling like I slept on the floor. I wake up feeling like I've been chewed up and spit out. Multiple alarms, and I always feel like I've been run over by a truck. Drug approved. Is disease real? This was the title of a New York Times article about fibromyalgia published the year I was diagnosed. A few years after I graduated college with a degree in literature, I found myself working at the world's largest market research company. My job was analyzing consumer sentiment as expressed in online spaces. This was another way of saying that I spent 8 hours a day lurking on message boards. The company's biggest clients were pharmaceutical companies, which meant that the message boards I lurked on were message boards for people with cancer and other serious illnesses. As you would expect, these messages written by sick people and their caregivers were intensely emotional. I am so happy the scans were good. Healing hugs and blessings. Hugs to you and yours. Love and hugs, prayers and hugs. Take good care, everyone. My prayers are with you. Keep us posted. But the world's largest market research company was uninterested in emotion. What they had me looking for was sentiment. I scored each sample as positive, negative, neutral, unsure, or no opinion. People and their details were shucked away unless they were significant enough to be included in the qualitative results. My job was to leverage this data to identify key factors that would make sick and dying people more interested in purchasing very expensive medicine. DH is on Erbitux, oxaliplatin, 5-FU, leucovorin. He has the Erbitux rash bad, but Onco is hesitant to prescribe an antibiotic. It was while I was immersed in this culture of online illness with its own language of acronyms and emoticons that I got sick myself. Working hurt. The precise mousing of data entry made my wrists tingle and go numb, and sitting at the keyboard made my shoulder muscles spasm. On the worst days, the stiffness spread to my hips and legs. The doctor in Fort Greene wrote a letter recommending a 2-week rest period. I faxed his letter to the HR department of the world's largest market research company. I called and emailed, and they didn't answer. I left messages, but they didn't return. I applied for short-term disability, and my claim was rejected twice. When the 2 weeks were over, I didn't feel any better. The doctor recommended another week of rest. I faxed, emailed, called HR. I was met with the same radio silence, which was starting to sound an awful lot like a static crackle softly whispering, "You lazy cunt, we don't believe you're sick, trying to trick us, you worthless piece of shit." Coincidentally, I came back to work the same day as another analyst who'd been out sick. He had broken his ankle snowboarding and he was wearing a boot. His cubicle was decorated with get well soon cards, and an edible arrangement bloomed festive pineapple chunks next to his monitor. My cube was as bare as I'd left it. A get well soon card would have acknowledged the fact of my illness, and as far as the world's largest market research company was concerned, I was faking it. Picturing my cubicle next to my coworkers is a perfect illustration of David B. Morris's differentiation between male and female pain. In The Culture of Pain, he writes, female pain is regularly disregarded, discounted, and dismissed, largely because it does not always conform to the clear organic model of appendicitis or a broken arm. As I read more about the history of invisible illness, I'm surprised and amused to diagnose myself with hysteria. There are just nasty fat women who want to collect disability checks. Doing stuff makes me tired, give me some money and or drugs. Lazy ass slugs who sit at home and watch Judge Judy while the rest of the world works for a living. 71% of them are fat women who don't ever get off their ass. Sorry if you don't like facts. Anyone who can read an internet article and say, ow, 11 times can have it. In The Body and Pain, Elaine Scarry describes pain's essential inexpressibility. For the person in pain, so incontestably and unnegotiably present is it that having pain may come to be thought of as the most vibrant example of what it is to have certainty, while for the other person, it is so elusive that hearing about pain may exist as the primary model of what it is to have doubt. Fibromyalgia is largely defined by a lack of visible symptoms or identifying lab tests. The only diagnostic criteria are the frustratingly vague tender points. Press here and I'll tell you if it hurts. Now press here. Now press here. All I have to do is tell you. All you have to do is believe what I tell you. I'm gonna stop there.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy. And that was from the beginning of the book, and it really couches, I guess, for a lot of people with chronic illness and disability, the kind of, okay, how many times do I have to say this? How many times do I have to prove it? And even then, does it matter? Like, and to who does it matter, you know? Because that Elaine Scarry quote, I think about it all the time, because doubt is such a nefarious thing in terms of something that can't be proven. And I know we have these conversations about the mind and body all the time in terms of mental health is as serious as a broken leg. You should treat it as seriously like this. But if you can't see invisible illnesses that do have these really physical impacts, it's, yeah, a minefield. And one of the things that I guess talking about the kind of tone that that you establish really well in the book is this knowing and engaged tone through a series of experimental prose and poems as the book progresses that are constantly undoing and remaking. And as you say in the book, trauma is non-linear. There are flashbacks and flash forwards, and my story is a story about forgetting. So despite the fragmentary nature of Tender Points, there's this gentleness to the narrative that never feels abrupt. And I wondered what the writing process of the book was like for you, and what was your starting point, and whether you found that you were organizing the book chronologically or thematically.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having me, by the way. This is really nice. Thanks for being here. Okay, so are you familiar with Maggie Nelson's book, Bluets?
Yes, I think
Yeah.
Charlotte and I talked about this very recently.
So I literally was just ripping off Bluets. There used to be a reading series here in San Francisco at a funny little art gallery in North Beach called the Emerald Tablet. And I forget the name of the reading series, but it was like imitations. And you were invited to read a piece of writing that you like and a piece of writing that was inspired by it. And so I read a selection from Bluets, and the first thing I wrote in Tender Points was, I'm going to do an imitation of Bluets, because I started the book because I wanted to figure out the connection between my history of abuse and the chronic pain I developed the morning after I recalled the abuse. Like, I knew there had to be a connection there, but it seemed like such a weird, not coincidence, but just like, how could these things be related? So, and like I say in the book, like I literally felt like I had these pieces that I needed to fit together to understand what was going on with my mind and body, my history and present, you know, all that. And I felt after reading Bluet's, like a lyric essay, a fragmented lyric essay was the way to do that, because it was just, Bluet's is a book about taking a lot of little pieces and putting them together, and they become more than the sum of their parts. But these themes and these feelings emerge. So, inspired by Bluet's, I wrote the first bits of Tender Points that I wrote. I know that one part was the section about the Sarah Winchester and the Winchester Mystery House, and looking at that house as a metaphor for how memory can kind of sneak by in the back stairs of the mind and body. So I know that that was something that I wrote for that, but I started there as an imitation of Bluet's, and then basically for about a year just collected different scraps and fragments in a really long Google Doc. So just memories I had of abuse, or memories of difficult visits to doctors, or just, yeah, memories of my life and my relationships during the time that I had vulvodynia, and also the time that I've had fibromyalgia. Little like bits of pop culture that kind of felt like metaphors for some of the experiences that I was having. You know, quotes from other people like Elaine Scarry, David B. Morris, and others that felt like they had something to say about what was going on with me. And then I did that for about a year. And then I kept saying to my friends, like, I don't know what to do. I feel really stuck with the book. And they kept saying, Amy, I think you need to print out that Google Doc. You have to look at it and see what's in it. Like, I think you have enough there, but you have to look at it. And I just kept saying, no, like, I just don't know what to do. And months passed. And finally I realized they were right, and I printed it out. And the writer, Stephanie Young, came over to my house and literally helped me cut it up with scissors and tape it together. And that was the process.
Kind of like the cut up method. Like, I love that. Like, it's really interesting. It reminds me of, I was listening to an interview with Carmen Maria Machado recently about In the Dream House, and she was talking about how it's a memoir that documents an abusive spousal relationship, a queer abusive spousal relationship, and putting them in order was really tricky for her. And she literally just said to her editor, like, please help me, because I've written it all and I don't know how to organize it. And having another person's involvement in that, I guess it must be quite like healing as well, I imagine, especially given the nature of some of the things in the book. That's really interesting, and gives me a lot of hope for the kind of fragmentary nature, which I think a lot of us probably create with when we have, you know, disability or chronic illness. And it's like, if we can just write a bit today, then we can piece it together another time, or with someone's help. And I guess what a lot of what I liked about like reading this book, and I think maybe like that perhaps to me at least, Maggie Nelson's work doesn't always have, is like this wry humor, like this kind of like really like laughing out loud at like this kind of cynicism in it, which I really like. And there's a bit where in the book you talk about Googling yellow wallpaper, referencing Charlotte Perkins Gilman's short story about gendered healthcare and hysteria, and find, quote, yellow wallpaper, I mean like swatches of it. And then your friend, who also writes about pain, emails you and says, quote, also on a side/main note, I'm sorry to hear you are living with chronic pain. It sucks in every way. And then you go on to say, I like what my friend wrote. Chronic pain is always on the side/main note, which I think is a really good way to describe it, because even if you're present, like we're all present here, if we're in pain in some way, we're thinking about it, because that's what our bodies are, right? And I wondered how conscious you were of including humor as part of your memoir, or whether that was just something that came out as you were writing.
Yeah, I'm laughing because like you might see me just like looking over here while we're talking, and it's because I recently bought this big bookshelf, and now all my books are organized in a way that makes me really happy. They're organized thematically, and I have all the books related to Tender Points and all the books related to my new novel. And so like I have this urge to like run and get my Miriam Taves books just because I love her so much, and I want to like wave them in front of you. But do you know Miriam Taves?
I don't think I do. Please get the book and wave it. Like I'm here for it.
Her name is pronounced, or sorry, her name looks like it would be pronounced Toes, but it's Taves apparently. She's
Right.
Canadian.
Yeah.
And most recently, actually has something I think that just came out called Fight Night that I don't really know about, but she wrote Women Talking, All My Petey Sorrows. She's just one of my favorite novelists. And one thing that she said in an interview, and I'm just gonna repeat her answer here because I thought it was really smart and it's true for me too, is someone asked her the same question, like, oh, did you add humor in because your novels tend to be about really heavy subjects? And she was like, no, like I did it because that's how life is. Like, even when you're visiting, you know, a dying family member in the hospital, like funny stuff is still happening. It just always happens together. So that's the first part of my answer. The other part is maybe unlike Miriam Toews, I was kind of intentional about it because if you imagine a version of Tender Points with none of the funny parts, like, first of all, I myself wouldn't even want to read it. I wouldn't like dare impose it on somebody else. Like, it would just be so fucking depressing. And it would also make it seem like the life of somebody with chronic illness was just constantly miserable, which it's not. Like, you know, I'm not a completely miserable, humorless person just because I have chronic pain. And there's a lot of funny things that happen along with challenges. So, yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, I think you're right. And I think so often, especially the way people or the media represents, I think it's getting better now, but the way that media has classically represented people with disabilities or chronic illness is always like really tragic. It's always victim-like and doesn't have any kind of like ownership over any other state of being, like pleasure or joy. And I'm really glad to see that changing. And I think like representations like this are really helpful to kind of complicate what people expect chronic illness to be like, because there does have a tendency to be monolithic representations, I guess, as well. And I guess thinking about naming and language, in another example of the kind of wryness that underscores the book and the undoing and remaking that you're continually engaged in throughout it, I'd like to talk about illness as metaphor, which I'm sure many people will know the Susan Sontag essay, and if not, we'll reference it in the chat, or just send out a note about it afterwards. And in the book you talk about, please excuse my awful French accent, écriture féminine en homme, or women's writing in drag. So throughout the book, the tone has this like acerbic, forthright quality and is committed to being prosaic and direct, at times extending metaphors of medical language. Quote, at the doctor's office, pain scales are impossible because I lost my zero. So early on in the book, you say, poetry fails me because it is not written plainly, but later then break into kind of poetic form throughout the latter half of the book, especially in an objective way to recall the trauma that you went through. You identify patriarchal structure of Western medicine in which patients must code switch to navigate if they want to be taken seriously. And I was wondering if you could talk about that kind of code switching that you did in the book through prose and poetry, and how much emotion played a role in a very objective memoir.
Yes. Excuse me. I'm gonna drink some water. I'm gonna think about that question.
Yeah, I have a bit of a sore throat, so apologies for my voice.
Excuse me. Yeah, I feel like there's a lot to answer there. You know, one thing that I want to say is I went to grad school for poetry. I disliked my program, and I could spend a whole hour talking about that, so I won't get into it. But one thing that I noticed about poetry, which was not my grad program's fault, it was a bigger thing that I noticed, was that it seemed like everyone I know who read poetry was already a poet themselves. And so it occurred to me that I could have written Tender Points as a book of poems, but one of the reasons I didn't is that then I felt like if I did that, I'm limiting my audience to chronically ill poets specifically, which not everybody is. So part of the reason for prose was like, I really wanted it to be accessible. I really wanted any person to be able to pick it up and know what I was talking about. And so I think there is some overlap between that impulse and the desire for like masculine direct clarity, and an awareness that yes, you have to talk a certain way to be respected and listened to by a certain kind of doctor who might even not respect you no matter how you talk. So yeah, I was kind of playing with that in the book. And there were sections where I felt like I had to really distill my thoughts and the facts that I found in my research really clearly. And then I took great pleasure in rupturing through that very clear prose style with emotional, like, I think the poetry is mostly when I'm describing a traumatic experience. It's when I'm describing my assault, or when I'm describing the like bad situations I've been in with doctors. And it wasn't intentional, but I just found that that's kind of how I wrote trauma, was like this more fragmented, lineated, like, yeah, that's just how it felt.
It's really interesting because I think when we think of poetry as well, and I guess we kind of tend to think of metaphors being, you know, very rich and, you know, lots of similes being used, and almost like a kind of masking sometimes of what we could be saying plainly. And I think what's really interesting about the poetry in Tender Points as well is, although it's fragmentary, it's so, I mean, it's like heartbreaking, some of it, because it is so direct and it is recalling these really traumatic incidents. But using poetry as a form to do that is such like you really sit with it, because you can't, it's almost like you have to read it a couple of times because you're like, is this oh no, it's fact, but it's a poem. But it's a really nice tension, I think, that you definitely explore really well. And talking about, I guess, trauma and mystery as well, and the uncertain, one of the things that I find really fascinating throughout this book is the kind of another tension it occupies between the certain and the uncertain. And I think anyone who's had trauma knows that kind of, I think you call them like mental, like, you know, black holes of memory as well. And the kind of, you don't believe yourself, you can't remember your recollections exactly. And so despite the kind of previous question about being plain speaking and objective, I find these similes you use really apt in the book, particularly for fibromyalgia, whether it's thinking of that particular condition as a mystery and trauma as a certain kind of key to unlock why I have chronic pain. And the black holes of the memory is something that is really, yeah, I'm going to be thinking about that one for a long time. Or you describe sexual assault as a GIF or a GIF, depending on your preference, which I'll just read. I have a wolf in my story, but he will not interrupt my walk through the forest, which is to say he's already interrupted it. He's the reason I'm here, sorting out the aftermath, which is to say the wolf is eternally interrupting my walk through the forest, emerging from behind the same tree again and again to block my path. Imagine it repeating like a GIF. So these similes, when they're slotted into the wider nonlinear narrative of memory and forgetting, evoke trauma as this loop. And I'm really interested in the shape of this narrative that you repeat really well through these images and just through returning to instances of pain. And elsewhere you speak about finding the spoon analogy, which for those who aren't familiar is a kind of metaphor where you talk about the number of spoons you have in a day to do tasks. So for example, you know, going and having a shower is already one spoon for someone who's chronically ill or disabled, then getting dressed is another spoon, and how able-bodied people have more spoons than disabled or chronically ill people have. So in the book, Amy talks about finding the spoon analogy of chronic pain cutesy and frustrating, but being able to think about, or being unable to think about something else to replace it. And I wonder, Amy, how conscious were you to try and avoid metaphor in your memoir, like thinking about Sontag and speaking plainly about illness? Is the preference for plain speaking a learned response to this kind of patriarchal medical system, or just wider culture of not believing women, full stop?
Oh, there's a lot there. Okay. So yeah, I mean, so in the book, I quote Sontag, excuse me, Sontag from Illness as Metaphor, basically saying that like the healthiest, best way to talk about illness is totally free of metaphors, just talking directly about it. And I think she was talking about cancer. And I know with cancer, I was recently, I mentioned that I work as a freelance writer doing marketing writing for different companies when I'm not doing my own writing. I was recently working for an organization that supports cancer patients, and I was writing like their style guide, like the kind of language they like to use. And they made a point of really saying, we want to use the word cancer. We don't want to tiptoe around it. That's what these patients are dealing with. They want to use the word, we want to use the word. And that felt very much echoing Sontag's recommendation not to use any language to hide an illness. And so I certainly don't I wouldn't talk about fibromyalgia as my cranky aunt has come to visit or something when I have like a pain flare. I don't know. But however, I mean, I think, yeah, there's similes that are useful. Like, I feel like I was hit by a bus. There's, I think, similes are useful when they do a better job of conveying the experience than using the language itself would. Spoon theory, I feel like I was really hard on it. And if anyone here likes it, that's fine. I'm like, it's perfectly fine. It's perfectly nice. If it works for you, that's good. I think, to me, I just felt like, how bizarre. Like, if I had a friend who, when I told her that I was in too much pain and too fatigued to go out with her that evening, if she couldn't understand that, but she could understand if I said, I only have like 2 spoons left, like, that's a weird friendship.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think those are my thoughts on that.
And I think what you highlight in the book as well is like how, I guess, at the risk of kind of overanalyzing what is probably what was quite a spontaneous thing, I guess, like you say, it is kind of couched in this domesticity and a very like homely kind of metaphor as well. And I think, like you say, if people can't understand the fact that when you say you're in chronic pain and you feel like you've been hit by a bus, but you can understand this like cutesy metaphor, I can understand that.
Yeah, I guess it surprises me that it caught on so much. And I appreciate that it's caught on so much. Like, if I see something on Instagram for spoonies, I'm like, ooh, like, I'm a spoonie, like, what's that about? Like, I'm curious about Spoonie Fest. But yeah, it does surprise me that people, I mean, I guess maybe it's just that maybe it's simple. Maybe people just saw chronic pain being represented at all, and that was enough to get excited about.
Definitely. And I guess like it's quite like quick to say as well. Like, it's in and of itself, it's like, I'm out of spoons. It's like, oh, okay. Like, it becomes shorthand so quickly through its ease, I guess, as well, which is, yeah. And like you say, being represented at all is probably half of that issue. But yeah, I think it's really fun as well, like navigating your own kind of similes. And I think, I know, like amongst friends, like I call it sharking. Like, if I have like low energy, I'm like a shark, like doing enough to get by, but then I'll just like send a shark emoji and that will be me. Like, that's the shorthand you kind of develop depending on, whatever kind of relationships you have. So I think, kind of continuing on the gender theme and narrative loops, I'm really interested in the way you portray medical trauma, both in the aftermath of the violation that you experienced at the hands of a medical professional at a really young age, and the recurrence of being treated by what you call a carousel of white male doctors, which I'm sure everyone in this chat has experienced at some point. So that particular line comes from a poem about halfway through the book, in which you reflect on the events between the then and now of your 10-year-old self who experienced the assault and the 30-year-old self you were when you were writing it. And there's a stanza that reads, "And I recognize the face of my rapist on every one of those doctors. Realize I spent 2005 reenacting my rape without knowing it." So both of the conditions you have, so vulvodynia and fibromyalgia, are deeply gendered and difficult to diagnose, meaning there is ample ground for dismissal, gaslighting, jumping through the medical hoops of doctors who are weirdly but almost certainly men. And you paint a wider societal picture through another poem in the book, which is called FTP, Fuck the Police, the opening line of which is "Doctors are cops." And the personal trauma within that structure, through a refrain that is devastatingly repeated throughout, "Why were we alone in the exam room?" I wonder if you could speak to how you continue to navigate the system as a chronically ill person that caused your trauma, as well as how you locate yourself as a person who is white, queer, and cisgendered, who will experience healthcare in a different way to other kinds of bodies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was such a weird, I guess you didn't ask me this, but trauma is just such a weird chronology, just to realize in retrospect that I was re-experiencing something very similar to a trauma I'd had as a kid without even having recalled that memory yet, was super weird. And if anyone wonders why I wrote this book out of order, it's because I experienced it out of order. I think someone once was like, well, why didn't you start the book with the assault you had as a child? And I was like, because that didn't happen first. Anyway, but yeah, I think I'm kind of an avoidant patient. Quite luckily, I have been relatively healthy and have just, I don't like going to the doctor. So I mostly try to avoid it unless something is really wrong. My chronic pain, I'm very lucky that it's persistent, but it's really not severe. As long as I get a lot of sleep, I am fine. So I haven't really done a lot to get to the root of it and try to find a cure, although perhaps in the future I will feel ready to do that. And yeah, I'm a woman, but I'm white, and I'm queer, but I'm in San Francisco. And so I don't think I especially have a hard time finding compassionate, high quality medical care. I do a lot of work to seek out doctors who are good listeners and respect their patients as people and respect women. I belong to a Facebook group for local sick and disabled queers, and that's how I found my current primary care physician, who herself is disabled and a wheelchair user. And just seeing her for the first time last year, I was just like, oh, this is amazing. My doctor is also disabled. It never occurred to me that I could have this experience, and there's something really nice about not having to explain certain things. So I think I try to be really picky about what doctors I let come near me.
Yeah, very understandably. And that's lovely. I think that kind of we'll pick up on this theme later, but that's speaking to community. And I'm reading a book about kind of disability justice and the importance of community and care webs. And I think it's really nice when those spaces already exist and you can sort of share tips on how to navigate particular things. And I know here I'm a member of similar groups where they talk about how you can fill in, your benefit kind of forms and things like that to, navigate the hoops that the state always puts in front of you. The book is Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice, and I'm going to put a link to it in the chat. But I will ask my next question first, and then I'll do that. This is kind of continuing on sharing trauma and the lenses through which we view trauma. As I'm a Twin Peaks fan, and one scene that lingers in the book is the Twin Peaks Tuesdays that you and your friends hosted, in which you baked a pie and watched David Lynch's iconic series. And one night after an episode, you and your friend end up discussing your experiences of rape. Quote, "This was the year I learned there's a unique kind of closeness you feel with someone after you compare your experiences of sexual violence." And like you, I believe that talking about sexual assault is really vital to break the hold of rape culture and the violence in silence that gives perpetrators power. But survivors can also feel that pressure, or too shameful or guilty or too much trauma to speak about what has happened, thus the cycle continues. And I think you occupy this tension of frustration of how much space rape culture occupies within our society, and how you sometimes want to chat about something really trivial or light, but trauma means that safety is always at the forefront of our mind, or if not safety, the pain that we're experiencing as a result of that trauma. And I wonder if you could speak to that tension of both the importance of sharing experiences as a collective, be it around sexual trauma or medical trauma, but also how, as an individual survivor of sexual assault, you navigate your well-being given the pervasiveness of rape in TV, the news, and I guess people coming up to you and talking about this book saying, I had a similar experience, and this kind of offloading in a way, or sharing that might be overwhelming.
Yeah, I think I might ask you to repeat that again if I forget it, but because it reminded me of like a very related answer that doesn't quite answer it directly, which is that you mentioned there's two little children pulling a wagon outside my window, and it's very cute.
That's very wholesome.
They're wearing rain boots. So I'm easily distracted. You mentioned the two novels that I'm working on, and one of the babies. I started, so 2016, I honestly spent doing a lot of like publicity for Tender Points. I did a tour. I wrote a lot about related stuff. The following year, 2017, which is 4 years ago, I started my first novel, the one called Utopia and Other Problems. And it's about rape. It's about the ways that friends can, even the most well-meaning feminist friends can kind of fuck up around their friends' rapes and just handle things in a way that their friends maybe weren't wanting. And it felt like a really important book because I surprised myself in real life by letting down a friend in that way. And I just felt like so compelled to work on it. I'd never seen this like experience represented in fiction before. I'd barely seen it touched on in zines. And I felt really compelled to write it. It felt really important, just like the way that rape affects us, not just the actual like act of rape, but this ongoing trauma that kind of ripples out and causes other people to hurt each other in other ways. So I've worked on it for 4 years. I'm almost done, which is great. And I'm still feeling really excited and energized about it. But about a year ago, I reached an impasse where I felt like I didn't know how to move forward. And so I started my second novel, Untitled Bisexual Jumpsuits Project. And my main experience working on it was like, oh my God, this isn't about rape. This is awesome. This is a road trip novel about artists making each other feel awkward. And just like the glee and joy that I felt being liberating myself to focus on something other than rape was just incredible. And so I think just my balancing these two projects and writing in between them is kind of just like a good example of how I feel like it is super important to continue these conversations and expand these conversations about rape. I really care about that, and it means a lot to me, and I'd never give that up. But it's also like, it's exhausting. And I really feel like we need to have room to like do trivial, whatever, bisexual jumpsuit novel. So the question you asked me though was like, I think I got it. So like, yeah, I think it's important. I don't think that anyone should ever feel obligated to talk about their rape. Like Facebook memories actually reminded me of a memory where I guess when the Me Too hashtag came to Facebook, I posted something that I still agree with, which is like, the post that everyone was sharing at the time was like, if everybody who'd been raped put hashtag Me Too in their status, society would finally see how big a problem rape is. And it's like, that is not the reason that society has not recognized how big a problem rape is. Like, don't put the onus on individual survivors for not speaking up enough. Like, first of all, nobody should feel obligated to talk about that. And second of all, like, that's not the issue. So yeah, I feel like it's important. It's an important conversation to be having, but it's not for everyone to be having all the time, and it shouldn't be anyone's obligation. I don't know. I don't seek out a lot of work, writing or TV or anything about rape. I really did love Miriam Toews' Women Talking, which is it's literally just like 300 pages of women talking. These women in a Mennonite community are trying to figure out what to do after they find out there have been some assaults in their small, isolated community. It's an amazing book. I love her so much. But I'm pretty selective. Like I think a lot of times the way I see in like a movie trailer, rape is being depicted, I'm just like, ooh, I shouldn't see that. That looks, I'm just going to be really annoyed the whole time. I don't think I have ever felt put out or like exhausted at all by like any individual talking to me about their experience, FYI. But yeah, I think I answered the question now.
You absolutely did, thank you. And I'm also really excited to read this joyful novel of artists making each other feel awkward. I can't wait. And yeah, I would love to. But I think like for my final question, continuing this idea of collectiveness and what society can do without putting the onus on individuals, which is why I think collectives is such a beautiful space. I'd like to think about reclaiming the chronically ill and disabled body collectively from capitalism. And in Tender Points, you reference the Socialist Patients Collective, which was a German activist collective working during the 1970s who recognized capitalism as the root cause of all illness. And their slogan was "Turn illness into a weapon." So given your experience of sick organizing and also working in corporate jobs that weaponize illness, how can we continue as a group or individually to resist and weaponize our illness against capitalism rather than capitalism weaponizing our illness against us? Which is a big question.
I have no idea. I mean, like, I do not have the answer to that. Like, I'm just going to be open with you.
Right.
But, I mean, a few thoughts. First of all, if we all called in sick, what would they do? They wouldn't be able to do a lot. But I mean, that's just another way of saying, like, if we all didn't go to work, what would they do? And I think that like that sort of aligns with my thinking that like, the problem of capitalism and disability is just kind of part of the whole problem with capitalism. I feel like any change has to generally come from dismantling capitalism, which is not something I am the authority on how to do. It does make me really happy to see that at least in the US, there have been like a record number of strikes recently. Like COVID has put a lot of new perspective on workers and labor, and I'm kind of excited to see what's going on with that. But I am not an authority on this.
No, that is absolutely fine. And I think this is like what I find really interesting about, because this is the thing, we all have to eat as well, right? So we do have to go to our corporate jobs, and I guess it's finding ways in which you can resist within the system while balancing it with work that actually matters outside of that system, which, yeah, one to think about. And if anyone has any answers to that, please drop them in the chat because I'd love to hear them.
Yeah.
So we're coming up to time. We've got 10 minutes left. So if anyone in the audience has any questions, now is your time to shine. But in the meantime, while if you're typing, if you're not typing, I just want to say thank you to Amy for being so generous with her answers and her time. And you can find out more about her work by visiting www.amyberko.com or following her on Instagram @HelloBerko or on Twitter @MondoBummer. And I'm going to pop these in the chat right now so you can all go and follow her, so we can all read this amazing novel that is going to come out. Well, two book projects that are going to come out. And yeah, I mean, it doesn't look like we have any questions. So cool. All right, I guess I'll let you all go and enjoy the rest of your evening. So thank you very much for everyone who joined us tonight. Resting Up has got more talks lined up throughout October and November, and you can find out more information about us on our Instagram page, which is @RestingUpCollective, all one word, or email us at theremotebody@gmail.com. And thank you very much again to Amy. We're all really, really happy that you're here. And
yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Thank you so much, everyone. Take care, be safe.